It is 1944. The night sky over Germany glows with fire. From above, thousands of American and British bombers pour down explosives on industrial centers, rail yards, and cities. On the ground, German military planners face an impossible challenge. They cannot stop the bombers. Their fighter jets are too few. Their anti-aircraft guns cannot reach the upper atmosphere where the heavy bombers fly. Yet they must do something. And so, in the months before Germany's final collapse, they devise one of World War II's most audacious deceptions. They will build entire fake cities, elaborate illusions of factories, railways, and residential areas. These deceptions are designed to fool the most advanced bomber forces in the world. This is the story of Kunststadt, the artificial cities that German commanders used as weapons of deception against the Allied air campaign. To understand the Kunststadt program, we must first understand the world that created it. By 1943, the strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany had become one of the defining features of the war in Europe. The Allies had long debated the effectiveness of bombing. Could aerial bombardment alone defeat Germany without a costly invasion? Strategic theorists believed it could. If Germany's factories could be destroyed, her transportation network severed, and her cities devastated, the Nazi state would collapse from within. The American approach was daylight bombing. The U.S. Army Air Forces believed their heavy bombers, the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator, were heavily enough armed to fight through German defenses. These aircraft mounted machine guns in turrets throughout their fuselages, allowing them to defend themselves against German fighters. The British, having suffered too many losses in daylight raids, chose night bombing. Their Lancaster and Halifax bombers operated under cover of darkness, dropping their loads on German cities with less precision but with greater safety. The results were devastating. German cities burned. Factories were damaged or destroyed. Thousands of civilian casualties mounted week by week. Yet the bombers kept coming. The German Luftwaffe threw up fierce resistance, but their fighter pilots, outnumbered and short of fuel, could not stem the tide. By 1944, the Allies had achieved air superiority over much of occupied Europe. The German military faced a strategic emergency. Their war production was under constant threat. Their ability to move troops and supplies was compromised. They had to do something to reduce the effectiveness of the bombing campaign. It was Dr. Hans Rumpf, a German engineer and officer in the Wehrmacht, who first conceived the idea that would become the Kunststadt program. Rumpf understood bomber tactics, having studied the patterns of Allied attacks. He knew that bombers relied on visual identification of targets, particularly during daylight raids. He knew that crews were fatigued after long missions and eager to confirm their bombing runs. He understood the psychology of combat pilots. Rumpf proposed a simple but bold concept. If the Germans could not prevent the bombers from reaching Germany, could they deceive the bombers instead? What if the Allies could be tricked into bombing elaborate fakes instead of real factories and cities? The idea had precedent. Military deception had been used throughout history, but never before had it been attempted on this scale. Never before had an entire nation attempted to create fake cities designed to fool modern aerial bombardment. Rumpf's proposal was elevated to the highest levels of the German military command. It received support and funding. The program was given the codename Kunststadt, artificial city. The goal was ambitious: construct convincing replicas of German cities and industrial areas near real targets. Complete with all the visual elements that bomber pilots would be looking for, the Germans approached the Kunststadt program with surprising scientific rigor. They understood that success depended on meticulous planning and detailed knowledge of their enemy's methods. Military photographers were dispatched to create comprehensive aerial surveys of targeted cities. These photographs were studied intensely. Where were the key industrial facilities? How were streets laid out? What did railway yards look like from the air? How were residential areas distributed? Military engineers created scale models of cities and proposed decoy sites. They conducted tests to understand how materials would appear from different altitudes. They experimented with paints and structures to determine what would look convincing from 20,000 feet or more. They consulted with specialists in lighting, studying how cities appeared at night and how fire would appear to bomber crews. The Germans recognized that the details mattered less than the overall composition. A fake factory building didn't need to be a perfect replica. It needed to look like a factory building from above. A painted street didn't need to be asphalt. It just needed to look like a real street from altitude. The human brain, when stressed and fatigued, would fill in details if the overall pattern was correct. The engineers also understood the psychological element. They knew that bomber crews, having flown through intense anti-aircraft fire, were often eager to complete their missions and return home. If a target looked plausible, if it appeared to be an important industrial facility, crews would be more likely to attack it. The deception didn't have to be perfect. It just had to be good enough. Between 1943 and 1944, construction crews across Germany undertook one of the most unusual military projects of the war. Dozens of Kunststadt sites were built near major German cities and industrial centers. The work was demanding and required considerable resources at a time when Germany was already facing critical shortages. Crews laid out false street patterns using paint and materials that would be visible on aerial photographs. In some cases, they actually paved portions of the false streets to make them more convincing. They constructed wooden and canvas frameworks that would form the silhouettes of factories, apartment blocks, and other urban structures. These structures were designed to appear three-dimensional from above, but used minimal materials. Railway yards were among the most important elements. The Germans knew that bombers targeted rail infrastructure as critical to military logistics. So the Kunststadt sites included elaborate false railway yards. Some featured tracks laid out in realistic patterns, complete with switches and sidings. Others used painted lines on the ground to simulate railway networks. Some even included canvas-covered wooden frames designed to represent locomotives and freight cars when viewed from above. The most sophisticated Kunststadt sites included actual buildings and structures, though usually built from wood rather than brick or steel. This allowed them to have more realistic appearance, while still being relatively inexpensive to construct. Fake smokestacks rose from the ground, designed to be visible from great distances and altitudes. Some even featured chimneys that could produce smoke, adding to the illusion that industrial activity was taking place. Perhaps the most ingenious aspect of the Kunststadt program was the lighting systems that the Germans developed. Night bombers often relied on navigation lights, the glow of fires, and other visual cues to locate their targets. The Germans understood this and created elaborate underground or concealed lighting networks at many of the artificial cities. These systems were designed to be activated when bombers were in the vicinity. They could create the illusion of streetlights illuminating a city at night. More dramatically, they could be used to simulate fires spreading through a city under attack. Special crews were trained to light small fires in carefully chosen locations around the perimeter of the Kunststadt sites when bombing raids approached. The effect was striking. A British or American bomber pilot, navigating by visual reference and watching for fires below, might see what appeared to be a city in the process of burning. This would confirm his identification of the target. He would release his bombs believing he had successfully struck the objective. In reality, he had bombed empty fields and wooden structures. Some of the lighting systems were quite sophisticated. The Germans used buried cables and electrical systems that had to be maintained and kept functional despite wartime shortages. This added to the overall complexity and cost of the program. Nevertheless, German commanders believed it was worth the investment if it could reduce the accuracy of the bombing campaign. Of the dozens of Kunststadt sites constructed during the war, several became particularly well known. One of the most elaborate was built near Cologne, one of Germany's most important industrial and transportation centers. Located about 15 kilometers from the real city, the Kunststadt Cologne covered several square kilometers of countryside. This artificial city included painted factory complexes, fake railway yards, and an extensive road network. The Germans invested considerable effort in making it credible. They even included signs of previous bombing damage, painting buildings with blast marks and impact patterns. This added authenticity and suggested to attacking pilots that the site had already suffered damage, but remained important enough to merit additional bombing. Another major site was constructed near Munich. This Kunststadt featured similar elements: painted urban layout, false industrial structures, and the elaborate lighting systems. The site was positioned carefully to be visible to approaching bombers, while drawing their attention away from the real industrial areas of the Munich region. Other significant Kunststadt sites were built near the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland. This area was subjected to some of the most intense bombing of the war. The Germans constructed multiple artificial cities in the region, hoping to disperse the bombing and protect their real factories. Given the critical importance of the Ruhr to German war production, the stakes for the deception operation were particularly high in this area. Additional sites were built near Berlin, Frankfurt, Hamburg, and other major cities. Each site was customized based on the geography and characteristics of the real city it was meant to represent. The overall effort represented a massive diversion of German resources and labor from other military priorities. The construction and maintenance of the Kunststadt program required a substantial workforce. Hundreds, possibly thousands of workers were involved in various capacities. Some were German military personnel, others were civilian workers. A significant portion were prisoners of war or forced laborers conscripted from occupied territories. Many of these workers did not fully understand the purpose of their labor. They were assigned tasks, painting streets, constructing wooden frames, laying out railway tracks, without necessarily knowing that they were creating elaborate deceptions. This compartmentalization of information was intentional, a security measure meant to prevent the program's details from becoming public knowledge. The work was sometimes dangerous. Workers at the Kunststadt sites were potentially at risk from bombing raids themselves. Although the sites were intentionally positioned away from real population centers, misdirected bombing could occur. There are accounts of workers being killed or injured during air raids on or near Kunststadt locations. The maintenance of these sites was ongoing. Paint faded and needed repainting. Wooden structures deteriorated in bad weather. The lighting systems required maintenance and repair. As the war progressed and German resources became increasingly scarce, maintaining the Kunststadt sites became more difficult. By late 1944, some sites fell into disrepair as labor was diverted to more immediately critical military needs. The operational procedures for the Kunststadt program were complex and required coordination between multiple military and civilian agencies. Intelligence personnel monitored Allied bombing patterns and flight paths. When they detected evidence that bombers might approach a Kunststadt site, alert procedures were activated. Ground crews would be stationed near the artificial cities. As bombers approached, identified by sound, radar, or visual spotters, the ground crews would prepare to activate the lighting systems and ignite the pre-positioned fires. The timing had to be precise. The lights and fires needed to appear at the right moment to attract the attention of the bomber crews, but not so early that the deception could be detected. After a bombing run on a Kunststadt site, German personnel would carefully document the results. They would count the bombs that had been dropped, estimate their explosive force, and assess the damage to the false city. This information would be reported up the chain of command. Commanders could then report to Berlin that the deception operation had been successful, with specific numbers of bombs diverted from real targets. The false cities would then be repaired and prepared for the next bombing raid. Paint would be touched up. Damaged structures would be rebuilt. The lighting systems would be maintained. New fires would be prepared. In many ways, the operational cycle for the Kunststadt program resembled a theatrical production, a carefully choreographed performance designed to deceive an external audience. Determining the actual success of the Kunststadt program has proven difficult for historians. During the war, German commanders claimed substantial victories. Reports from various Kunststadt sites indicated that thousands of bombs were being diverted from real targets. If accurate, this would have represented a significant achievement. Reducing the bombing tonnage falling on German industry by even a small percentage would have military value. However, the accuracy of these reports is questionable. Military officers have incentives to report success for programs that consume resources. Subordinates may have inflated numbers to please their superiors. The actual effectiveness of the deception may have been less than claimed. Modern historical analysis has suggested that while the Kunststadt program did deceive some bomber crews at least some of the time, its overall impact may have been limited. Historians estimate that perhaps 5 to 10% of bombing tonnage dropped on Germany during the peak periods may have been diverted to the artificial cities. This is not negligible, but it is far less than the German claims. Several factors limited the program's effectiveness. As the war progressed, Allied intelligence learned about the Kunststadt sites. Bomber crews received briefings about the locations of artificial cities and were instructed to avoid them. The Allies developed better navigation systems, including radar and electronic navigation aids, that made them less dependent on visual identification of targets. Additionally, many bomber crews, particularly those with experience, learned to recognize the signs of false construction, the suspicious regularity of painted lines, the lack of weathering on wooden structures, the telltale signs of recent construction. Allied intelligence had pieced together evidence of the Kunststadt program through multiple sources. Reconnaissance flights over Germany provided aerial photographs that showed the suspicious construction of large artificial installations. Interrogations of German prisoners of war yielded information about the deception program. Captured documents provided further details. By late 1943 and early 1944, senior Allied commanders were aware that the Germans were attempting deception operations. The response was pragmatic and multifaceted. First, bomber crews were briefed about the existence and locations of the Kunststadt sites. Commanders distributed maps and photographs showing where the artificial cities were located. Pilots were instructed to treat these sites with skepticism and to focus their bombing on confirmed real targets. Second, specialist personnel were assigned to analyze bombing results. Photo reconnaissance flights were flown after bombing raids, and the resulting photographs were carefully analyzed. Intelligence officers could compare bomb damage patterns with pre-raid photographs. If bombing had struck a location where no real industrial capacity was known to exist, it suggested that the raid had hit a Kunststadt site. This information was fed back to commanders and pilots. Third, the Allies implemented more sophisticated navigation and bombing techniques. The introduction of radar-guided bombing allowed bombers to hit targets obscured by clouds or darkness, making them less dependent on visual identification. Electronic navigation systems reduced reliance on visual reference points. These technological advances, while developed for other reasons, had the secondary effect of making the Kunststadt program less effective. The secrecy surrounding the Kunststadt program was always imperfect. In any large military operation, especially one that employs thousands of workers over an extended period, some information inevitably leaks. Workers talked to friends and family. Local civilians observed the construction. Military personnel at various levels became aware of the program. While the Germans took security measures, including compartmentalization of information and classification of documents, they could not entirely prevent information from spreading. The Allies, with their extensive intelligence networks across occupied Europe and within Germany itself, gradually learned more details about the program. Resistance networks reported on the construction of artificial cities. Polish and Czech resistance groups provided information about Kunststadt sites in areas near their homelands. German émigrés with knowledge of military affairs provided insights to Allied intelligence services. One particularly important source was the signals intelligence effort. While the Germans believed their military communications were secure, British cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park were reading German military messages. When German commanders sent encrypted orders related to the Kunststadt program, these were often decrypted and analyzed by Allied intelligence. This provided details about the locations, construction progress, and operational status of various artificial cities. Additionally, aerial reconnaissance provided increasingly detailed information. High-altitude reconnaissance aircraft photographed the Kunststadt sites repeatedly over months and years. Changes in construction could be tracked. Patterns of activity could be observed. Photo interpreters developed expertise in identifying the characteristics of artificial cities versus real industrial installations. The Germans found that maintaining operational security became increasingly difficult as time progressed. As 1944 advanced, the effectiveness of the Kunststadt program declined. Several factors contributed to this downturn. First, pilot experience and knowledge increased. As bomber crews flew multiple missions over Germany, they became more sophisticated at identifying targets. They learned the characteristics of real industrial areas versus artificial ones. They shared information about suspected Kunststadt sites. Unit commanders disseminated intelligence about the deceptions. Experienced pilots became skeptical of targets that seemed too convenient or too exposed. Second, Allied bombing tactics evolved. Early bombing relied heavily on visual identification of targets by bombardiers. As the war progressed, more bombing was done using radar, electronic navigation aids, or pre-planned patterns. This made the deception less relevant. If a bomber was navigating by radar rather than visual reference, the appearance of the target from the air mattered less. Third, German resources for maintaining the Kunststadt sites became increasingly strained. By late 1944, Germany was losing the war on all fronts. Military resources were desperately needed for defense against the Soviet advance. Resources were needed for coastal defenses in anticipation of invasion. Resources were needed for air defense against the continuing bombing campaign. Maintaining the artificial cities became a lower priority. Many sites fell into disrepair. Fourth, the Kunststadt program itself became less of a secret. While the Germans had attempted to maintain operational security, enough information had been disseminated. The Allies not only knew about the program but understood its general parameters. Knowing that the Germans were attempting this deception made it easier to devise countermeasures. After the war, many of those involved in the Kunststadt program provided accounts of their experiences. German officers discussed the program's conception and implementation. Workers described the labor involved in construction. Bomber pilots, some of whom had unknowingly bombed Kunststadt sites, reflected on the deception once they learned about it. One German officer later wrote that the program represented an attempt to fight a war of technology and firepower with ingenuity and creativity. While they could not match the Allies' industrial capacity or their numerical superiority, the Germans believed they could outthink their opponents. The artificial cities were one manifestation of this philosophy. They represented an attempt to impose psychological and tactical costs on the Allies. This would be despite overall German inferiority. American and British bomber crews expressed mixed reactions when they learned about the Kunststadt program. Some felt embarrassed at having been deceived. Others expressed admiration for the German ingenuity. Many pilots who had dropped bombs on fake cities never learned this fact until years after the war, if at all. The uncertainty about whether their bombs had hit real targets or artificial ones was one of many frustrations. Historical records and documents about the Kunststadt program are extensive. German archives contain administrative records about the construction and operation of specific sites. Orders and reports provide insight into the program's scope and objectives. Post-war interviews with German personnel yield personal accounts and details that illuminate the human element. These sources, combined with aerial photographs and physical evidence from the sites themselves, allow modern historians to reconstruct the program with reasonable accuracy. Examining specific Kunststadt sites in detail provides insight into how the program operated. Consider the artificial city constructed near Cologne. Built in rural countryside, this Kunststadt covered an area of approximately 4 square kilometers. It included a comprehensive false street plan, mimicking the layout of the real city. False railroad yards occupied a significant portion of the site with tracks, switches, and sidings, painted on the ground and supplemented with wooden structures representing freight cars and locomotives. The Kunststadt Cologne featured approximately 30 false factory buildings, constructed from wood but designed to appear convincing from altitude. These structures included false smokestacks, some of which could be used to generate smoke to simulate industrial activity. An elaborate electrical system allowed lighting to be activated across the site. It could simulate urban illumination or the spread of fires. According to German records, the Kunststadt Cologne was attacked multiple times during 1943 and 1944. Bomber crews released bombs on the artificial city, believing they had struck important military and industrial targets. German personnel documented these raids, though determining the accuracy of their records presents challenges for modern historians. Similarly, the Kunststadt near Munich was a substantial installation. Located in the open countryside west of the city, this artificial installation covered several square kilometers. It included all the standard elements: false streets, mock factory buildings, painted railway facilities. It too featured a sophisticated lighting system and was reportedly attacked multiple times. The construction and operation of these sites consumed significant resources. Hundreds of workers were involved. The maintenance of the sites continued throughout 1943 and 1944, yet their strategic impact remains uncertain. Some of the bombs dropped on them diverted tonnage from real targets, but determining the precise percentage remains speculative. The Kunststadt program was not the only deception operation conducted by Germany during World War II. German military commanders, operating on the principle that they could not match their enemy's industrial and military might, invested heavily in deception and camouflage operations across multiple theaters. Dummy airfields were constructed to misdirect bombers during the Battle of Britain. Elaborate camouflage schemes protected German airfields and military installations from Allied air attack. Fake military units were created to mislead the Allies about German dispositions. Underground factories were constructed to protect German war production from bombing. The Kunststadt program was distinctive in its scale and ambition, but it fit within a broader strategic approach. German commanders understood that asymmetric warfare, using unconventional means to counter superior forces, was necessary. Deception, camouflage, and misdirection were tools available to them, even when firepower and resources were insufficient. This philosophy had deep roots in German military tradition. The German military theorist Karl von Clausewitz, writing in the 19th century, had emphasized the importance of deception and the psychological dimension of warfare. German 20th century officers educated in this tradition were primed to think creatively about how to frustrate superior enemies. Regarded from a purely technical perspective, the Kunststadt program represents a remarkable achievement. Engineering and industrial planning under wartime constraints. The Germans, working under wartime constraints and with limited resources, designed and constructed elaborate false installations, covering several square kilometers each at multiple locations. The engineering challenges were substantial. Creating structures that appeared convincing from altitudes of 20,000 feet or more required understanding perspective and scale, and the visual characteristics of structures as viewed from above. The engineers involved in the Kunststadt program had to think in 3 dimensions and understand how structures would cast shadows and appear in photographs. The lighting systems represented particularly sophisticated technology for their time. The Germans had to design electrical networks that could be buried or concealed, maintained despite wartime shortages and activated on command. The system had to be reliable, as failures would undermine the deception. Some of the engineers and technicians involved in the Kunststadt program later applied their expertise in post-war technical fields. The coordination required to construct multiple sites simultaneously across Germany demanded substantial organizational capability. Materials had to be procured, workers assigned, construction overseen, and the sites maintained. This required effective administration and logistics. The Kunststadt program demonstrated that even a nation facing multiple military crises could marshal sufficient organizational capacity to implement ambitious new deception operations. As Germany's military situation deteriorated in late 1944 and early 1945, the Kunststadt program gradually declined. By autumn 1944, it was clear that Germany would not win the war. The Soviet army was advancing from the east. The Allies were consolidating their position in France following the D-Day invasion. German air defense was collapsing as fuel shortages prevented adequate fighter operations. In this context, maintaining elaborate fake cities seemed increasingly pointless. Construction and maintenance activities at many Kunststadt sites slowed or ceased. Resources were diverted to more immediate military needs. By early 1945, many of the artificial cities were in disrepair. Paint was faded. Wooden structures had deteriorated. Some sites were abandoned entirely. As the Allies advanced into Germany in 1945, they encountered the remains of the Kunststadt program. American and British soldiers discovered these elaborate false cities, which often baffled them until the deception was explained. Some units documented what they found. Photographs were taken, reports were filed. But for most participants in the liberation of Germany, the Kunststadt sites were simply curious anomalies on the landscape. Artifacts of a failed defensive strategy. Some of the Kunststadt sites were deliberately dismantled by the Germans before the Allies arrived, perhaps to prevent the Allies from learning details about the program. Other sites were left standing and eventually dismantled by Allied authorities as occupation proceeded. Still others were simply abandoned and gradually deteriorated over the following years and decades. After the war, Allied military intelligence services conducted investigations into the Kunststadt program. American and British intelligence officers interviewed captured German personnel who had been involved in the program. They examined German documents, including construction plans, operational records, and damage assessments. They reviewed aerial photographs from the war years. This post-war investigation provided substantial documentation of the program's scope and operation. Military historians began analyzing the Kunststadt program almost immediately after the war ended. Officers and analysts who had been involved in the bombing campaign wanted to understand what had happened. Had they been significantly deceived? How effective had the German deception been? What could be learned from the experience? The analysis revealed a more complex picture than either complete success or complete failure. The Kunststadt program had scored some successes. Certainly, some bombing raids had been directed at artificial cities instead of real targets. Some tonnage of bombing had been diverted, though determining the exact amount remained speculative. At the same time, the program had been far less effective than German commanders had hoped or claimed. The bombing campaign against Germany had continued with devastating effectiveness. Despite the deception operations, the Kunststadt program raised important strategic questions that military theorists have discussed for decades. How effective can deception be in the context of industrial warfare, when one side possesses overwhelming advantages in firepower, production, and resources? Can a weaker side use psychological and tactical deception to significantly reduce effectiveness? The answer suggested by the Kunststadt program is that deception can make a difference at the margins. It can reduce the effectiveness of bombing raids. It can cause an enemy to question the reliability of intelligence and reconnaissance. It can impose psychological cost and create uncertainty, but it cannot overcome fundamental disadvantages in firepower, resources, and industrial capacity. The Kunststadt program demonstrated the limits of deception as a strategic tool. However, it also demonstrated the value of deception as a tactical weapon. Even when overall military outcomes are determined by other factors, deception can provide tactical advantages and reduce an enemy's operational effectiveness. Modern military strategists have drawn lessons from the Kunststadt program. If an inferior force must engage a superior force, deception becomes more valuable. The principle applies to contemporary military operations in various forms, from camouflage of military installations to cyber warfare and electronic deception. The underlying principles of the Kunststadt program remain relevant. More than 75 years after the end of World War II, the Kunststadt program continues to fascinate. Military historians, strategists, and the general public remain interested. The program has been featured in numerous documentaries, books, and academic papers. It has been discussed in military academies as a case study in deception and innovative tactical thinking. The program appeals to our imagination because it represents an attempt to think creatively, an attempt in the face of overwhelming adversity. Even though the Kunststadt program could not change the outcome of World War II, it represented an effort by German commanders to do something other than simply accept defeat. It showed determination and ingenuity. The specific sites where Kunststadt installations once stood vary in their current status. Some have been built over with post-war development. Modern towns and industrial facilities now occupy areas where fake cities once stood. In other cases, the sites remain relatively unchanged. Still fields or forests, with only historical markers or local memory indicating what once stood there. In some locations, particularly in Germany, there has been effort to preserve the memory of the Kunststadt program. Museums include exhibits about the deception operations. Historical societies maintain records and artifacts. Researchers continue to investigate the sites, using modern technology, including ground-penetrating radar and aerial surveys, to locate and document the remains of the artificial cities. Behind the statistics and strategic analysis of the Kunststadt program were thousands of individual people. Consider the story of the engineer tasked with designing the fake factory complex near Cologne. He had studied the real factories of the Rhineland, photographed them from various angles, created scale models. He had to think about how to create the visual appearance of industrial capacity without actually building an industrial facility. His work was technical but also creative. Or consider the workers who constructed the wooden frames and painted the street patterns. Many were forced laborers from occupied territories. They worked long hours under wartime conditions, building structures for purposes they might not fully understand. Some took pride in their work anyway, understanding perhaps that they were contributing to a creative effort. Others simply endured. Consider the German officers who staffed the Kunststadt sites, waiting for bombing raids to approach, preparing the lighting systems, lighting the fires when the moment came. They had to remain alert during night hours, ready to activate the deception when needed. Some found the work mundane. Others understood its strategic importance and took their responsibilities seriously. And consider the bomber pilots who, believing they were hitting real targets, were actually attacking empty fields and wooden structures. Some of these pilots never learned the truth. They filed their reports, received their congratulations, moved on to the next mission. After the war, learning that they had been deceived was sometimes frustrating. For others, it was a fascinating footnote to their military service. The Kunststadt program operated in a broader context of military deception during World War II. The Germans were not unique in attempting deceptions, though the Kunststadt program was distinctive in its scale and sophistication. The Allies conducted their own deception operations. Operation Fortitude, the deception operation surrounding D-Day, was arguably more successful and strategically important than the Kunststadt program. It had profound strategic consequences. It tied down German military resources and may have changed the course of the war. The British conducted extensive deception operations in North Africa and the Mediterranean, using dummy tanks, inflatable aircraft, and false communications to mislead the German and Italian high commands. These operations sometimes had measurable impact on military outcomes. The Kunststadt program differed from most other deceptions. This operation convinced the German high command that the invasion of France would occur at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. In that, it relied primarily on physical construction rather than communications deception or false military formations. It was essentially a three-dimensional lie constructed across several square kilometers. In that sense, it was unique among World War II deception operations. When considering the Kunststadt program from a technological perspective, it is important to remember the limitations of the era. The Germans and the Allies were both working with 1940s technology. They had no satellites providing continuous surveillance. They had no high-resolution digital imagery. The technology of aerial reconnaissance, bombing, and navigation was primitive by modern standards. The Kunststadt program would be more difficult to execute in the modern era. Satellite surveillance equipped with multispectral imaging and high resolution makes it much harder to deceive observers about what exists on the ground. Modern bombers use GPS guidance and other precision navigation systems, reducing reliance on visual target identification. Modern military forces have extensive technological means of verifying target locations and characteristics before attack. However, the principles underlying the Kunststadt program remain relevant. Even in the modern era, deception can have tactical value. Electronic warfare, cyber deception, and false information operations achieve effects similar to what the Kunststadt program attempted. The specific techniques have changed, but the underlying concept remains the same. Using misdirection to reduce an enemy's operational effectiveness remains valid. One of the critical questions about the Kunststadt program concerns its strategic cost-benefit ratio. The Germans invested considerable resources in the program: labor, materials, planning effort, and maintenance. This was during a period when Germany was desperately short of resources. Could these resources have been better employed? From the perspective of 1943 and 1944, when the Kunststadt program was at its peak, German military planners believed that the investment was justified. They calculated that if the program could reduce the effectiveness of Allied bombing by even a few percentage points, the resources expended would be worthwhile. Given that the bombing campaign was threatening German war production, reducing its effectiveness seemed a reasonable military priority. However, others have argued that the resources expended on the Kunststadt program would have been better used for direct air defense, increased fighter production, or other more conventional military efforts. The counter-argument is that the Kunststadt program, while expensive, was cheaper than alternatives. Building more fighters to defend against bombers would have consumed more resources. Building shelters or hardening real factories would have been even more expensive. From a purely economic perspective, one could argue that the Kunststadt program was relatively efficient. It consumed resources, but fewer resources than alternative defensive measures. However, the overall impact on German military outcomes was marginal at best. Military strategists today continue to study the Kunststadt program. It offers lessons applicable to modern conflicts. The fundamental principle that a weaker force can partially offset the advantages of a stronger force through deception remains true. In the context of asymmetric warfare, where conventional military strength is not evenly distributed, deception becomes even more valuable. A weaker adversary facing a stronger one often employs deception and camouflage. Understanding how the Kunststadt program worked provides insight into this strategy. The program also illustrates the importance of understanding an adversary's psychology and perceptions. The Germans succeeded not by creating perfect replicas, but by creating structures that were good enough. Good enough to fool tired, stressed pilots operating in the fog of war. This principle applies to modern military deception as well. The Kunststadt program contributed to the evolution of military thinking about deception. After the war, military academies incorporated lessons from the program into their instruction. On deception and tactical operations, the program demonstrated that deception could be implemented on a large scale and could achieve tactical results even when it failed to achieve strategic objectives. Deception doctrine has evolved considerably since World War II. Modern military forces employ deception as a standard element of military planning. The principles established during World War II remain central to modern deception operations, including the importance of understanding the adversary's decision-making process and the value of creating plausible alternative scenarios. The Kunststadt program is sometimes referenced as a historical example of denial and deception. These are distinct concepts. Denial refers to preventing an adversary from obtaining information. Deception refers to providing false information that leads an adversary to wrong conclusions. The Kunststadt program employed both, denying the Allies clear visibility of real targets, while deceiving them into believing artificial installations were real. While the Kunststadt program is often discussed in terms of military strategy and engineering, it is important to remember that real people were involved, and there were human costs. Workers died in accidents during construction. Some were killed when bombing raids struck the Kunststadt sites themselves or nearby areas. Some forced laborers employed in the construction never survived the war. German military personnel assigned to the Kunststadt sites faced their own dangers. Anti-aircraft crews defending the sites faced intense bombing and fighter attacks. The men who lit the fires and activated the lighting systems were in vulnerable positions during bombing raids. Some were killed in the course of their duties. Bomber crews attacking what they believed to be real targets faced the same dangers, whether they were hitting artificial cities or real ones. The anti-aircraft fire was just as deadly. Fighter attacks were just as devastating. The bombers that were shot down over Germany crashed with equal finality, whether their last mission had been against a real factory or a fake one. Civilian populations in areas surrounding the Kunststadt sites could be affected. Although the artificial cities were positioned away from major population centers, bombing could spread beyond intended targets. Civilians in nearby villages and towns sometimes suffered casualties. When bombing raids occurred near Kunststadt installations, the construction of the Kunststadt program left physical marks on the German landscape. Forests were cleared. Fields were altered with painted markings and wooden structures. Electrical systems buried underground altered subsurface conditions. While these changes were relatively minor, compared to the massive environmental impacts of the bombing campaign, they were part of the war's legacy on the land. After the war, many of the Kunststadt sites were dismantled. The structures removed, the painted markings allowed to fade. In some cases, the land has reverted to its natural state. In others, it has been developed for post-war construction or agricultural use. Archaeological surveys have identified some of the old Kunststadt sites, where subsurface remains including concrete foundations, buried cables, and other artifacts can be detected. Using modern technology, some of the sites remain visible today as faint traces in the landscape. Aerial photography can sometimes reveal the old painted street patterns, visible in satellite imagery as subtle variations in vegetation or soil tone. Local residents in areas surrounding old Kunststadt sites sometimes have family memories, or local oral traditions about the artificial cities that once existed in their communities. The Kunststadt program must be understood in the context of other wartime innovations and desperate measures undertaken by Germany as the war progressed. As German prospects deteriorated, the military sought increasingly imaginative solutions to military problems. The development of jet aircraft, rocket weapons, advanced U-boats, and new tactical formations all represented attempts to regain military advantage through innovation. The Kunststadt program was similar in character to these other initiatives. It represented an effort to solve a military problem through ingenuity and innovation, rather than through conventional military means. Like many of these efforts, it showed creativity and technical achievement, but ultimately could not overcome the fundamental military imbalances that had developed. This pattern of late-war innovation reflected both the desperation of the German situation and the sophistication of German military science and engineering. German scientists and engineers continued to produce innovative ideas and designs. Even as their nation was losing the war, some of these innovations would have been game-changing if deployed earlier, with greater resources. Others, like the Kunststadt program, were interesting but ultimately marginal in their impact. Reconstructing the history of the Kunststadt program requires consulting multiple historical sources. German military documents provide information about planning and construction. Wartime photographs from both German aerial surveys and Allied reconnaissance flights provide visual documentation. Post-war interrogations and interviews with German personnel provide personal accounts. Allied military records document the intelligence gathering and analysis of the deception program. Aerial photographs are particularly valuable historical sources for studying the Kunststadt program. A trained photo interpreter can identify characteristics that distinguish artificial cities from real ones. The regularity of painted lines, the uniformity of wooden structures, the lack of natural weathering and aging on surfaces designed to appear aged all provide clues. Comparing photographs taken at different times allows historians to track construction progress. And the effects of bombing and maintenance activities. German archives contain administrative records about the Kunststadt program. Personnel rosters, construction reports, material requisitions, and operational records provide detailed information about the program's organization and implementation. These documents are sometimes terse and bureaucratic, but they provide concrete data about aspects of the program that might otherwise remain unknown. Post-war testimonies provide another crucial source. Interviews conducted with German officers, engineers, and workers during the immediate post-war period captured information while participants' memories were relatively fresh. Some interviews were conducted by Allied military personnel, others by academic researchers or journalists. These varied sources provide multiple perspectives on the program. Visual documentation of the Kunststadt program exists in various forms. Wartime photographs taken by German photographers document the construction process and completed installations. Some of these photographs were official military documentation. Others were more informal, taken by personnel involved in the program, who recognized the historical significance of what they were participating in. Allied aerial reconnaissance photographs provide another crucial visual source. British and American reconnaissance flights photographed the German countryside regularly throughout the war. These photographs, many of which have been preserved in military archives, show the Kunststadt sites in various stages of construction and operation. Comparing multiple photographs taken at different times reveals how the artificial cities were built and maintained. Post-war photographs document the remains of the Kunststadt sites, as they were discovered by Allied forces. American military photographers documented some of the installations for the military record. These photographs show the sites before they were dismantled or allowed to deteriorate completely. Modern photographs, including satellite imagery, document what remains of the Kunststadt sites today. Some locations show little visible evidence of what once stood there. Other sites have preserved ruins or foundations. Modern technology, including ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR surveying, has allowed archaeologists and historians to detect subsurface remains, revealing more detail than surface observation alone would provide. More than 75 years after the Kunststadt program was abandoned, what can we conclude about this remarkable wartime effort? The program represented a genuine attempt by German military planners to address a critical strategic problem through creative thinking and technical innovation. The problem was real. The Allied bombing campaign was devastating German war production and infrastructure. The response was imaginative: build fake cities to deceive the bombers. The program achieved partial success. Some bombers were deceived at least some of the time. Some tonnage of bombs was diverted from real targets. The operation demonstrated that even against overwhelming military disadvantage, a skillful military force could devise tactics that imposed costs and created complications for a stronger opponent. Yet the program's limitations were ultimately decisive. It could not reverse the broader course of the war. It could not prevent the bombing campaign from achieving its strategic objectives. It could not restore Germany's ability to win the war. In the context of a comprehensive military defeat, the Kunststadt program was a small and localized success in the midst of strategic catastrophe. Perhaps that is the ultimate lesson of the Kunststadt program. Tactical and operational successes, even creative and impressive ones, cannot overcome strategic disadvantage when one side has been decisively defeated in the overall balance of military and economic power. Small successes in deception and tactics remain small. They may matter at the margins, but they do not change fundamental outcomes. The story of how German commanders fooled Allied bombers with fake cities is ultimately a story about human ingenuity, determination, and the limits of creativity. Creativity in the face of overwhelming military disadvantage. The Kunststadt program was conceived out of desperation, a last-ditch effort to reduce the effectiveness of an enemy that was winning the war. Through superior technology, industrial capacity, and military strength, the Germans who designed and built these artificial cities demonstrated impressive technical and organizational capability. They showed that even in total war, with resources stretched across multiple military fronts, a nation could conceive and execute ambitious deception operations. They proved that the psychology of combat, the limits of human perception under stress, and the fog of war could be exploited by a weaker side fighting a stronger opponent. Yet for all their ingenuity, the artificial cities could not stop the bombers. The Allies eventually learned about the deception and adapted their tactics accordingly. The bombing campaign continued with devastating effectiveness. Germany's industrial capacity continued to decline. The Kunststadt program, like so many other German wartime innovations, represented a tactical response to a strategic problem that no mere tactics could solve. The legacy of the Kunststadt program extends beyond World War II. Military strategists continue to study the program as a case study in deception, asymmetric warfare, and the psychological dimensions of combat. The specific techniques have become obsolete in an age of satellite surveillance, precision-guided weapons, and real-time data systems. Yet the principles remain relevant in any military context. That a weaker force can use psychology and misdirection to impose costs on a stronger force remains true. Understanding an adversary's decision-making process is key to deception. That operational success cannot overcome strategic disadvantage remains true. The Kunststadt program reminds us that warfare involves more than just firepower and production capacity. It involves human psychology, perception, creativity, and ingenuity. It reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, humans continue to think, innovate, and attempt to impose their will. And it reminds us that while these human efforts can achieve tactical success, they remain ultimately constrained by the material realities of military power. The fake cities of Germany stand now only in photographs and in historical records. The structures have been dismantled or have deteriorated. The workers who built them have largely passed into history. The bomber pilots who may have dropped bombs on them are mostly no longer living. Yet the memory of the Kunststadt program persists, a fascinating historical episode that continues to intrigue and instruct those who study military history and the nature of warfare itself.